The story of redemption. Redemption begins in a quiet place, a place where the world falls away and the echoes of our own life rise to the surface. It begins in the moments when we realize that something has fractured within us, when the story we once carried no longer fits, and when the person we believed ourselves to be slips through our fingers like ash. In that fragile silence, a deeper truth emerges. Every human life, no matter how strong or courageous, eventually encounters a breaking point, a fall, a moment of reckoning with our own shadow, our limits, our wounds, and the consequences of choices we can no longer undo. As you settle into this story, you might take a gentle breath, easing your shoulders, allowing your body to soften just a little. Nothing forced, simply a small invitation into the present moment. Because redemption is not a concept to be rushed through. It is a living experience, a slow turning, a long, patient shift in the inner landscape of the mind and heart. The story of redemption is the story of humanity itself. It is the story of how we break, how we confront the fragments, and how we rise from the ruins with a new understanding of who we are. Across cultures, across centuries, across mythologies and spiritual traditions, humans have returned again and again to this arc. The descent, the confrontation, the transformation, the return. And although the languages differ, the symbols shift, and the rituals evolve, the underlying pattern remains the same. Something falls apart. Something is faced, something is rebuilt, something returns renewed. In psychology, redemption is the process of integrating the broken parts of the self, of repairing the narrative that has cracked under pressure. In neuroscience, it is the rewiring of circuits once shaped by fear, stress, or regret, gradually forming pathways of stability and strength. In philosophy, redemption is the reclaiming of meaning. In myth, it is the journey through darkness toward light. In emotion, it is the quiet rediscovery of worth. And in the everyday human world, it is the courage to try again, to heal what was harmed, to become someone new. Throughout this journey, you will notice moments of stillness between ideas. These pauses are intentional. They are reminders that redemption requires space, breath, and the willingness to sit with what once felt overwhelming. When you feel it, take another slow, easy breath. Let it ground you. Redemption is not merely what happens after a mistake. It is not a single moment of forgiveness or absolution. It is the long arc of transformation that unfolds when a human being decides not to remain defined by the fall. It is the movement from despair toward possibility, from fragmentation toward wholeness, from regret toward responsibility, from fear toward courage. It is, in many ways, the quiet victory of the human spirit. As we begin this exploration, imagine the countless lives that have walked this same path. People who have stumbled, failed, broken, and risen again. People who have carried guilt and then found grace. People who have lost themselves and slowly returned. Their stories form the hidden architecture of our species. They remind us that redemption is not an exception to the human experience. It is a fundamental part of it. And so our journey begins here, in the quiet, in the breath, in the awareness that redemption is not distant or abstract, but alive within every person who has ever hoped to mend what was once shattered. Let us step softly into this story. Let us trace the arc from the fall to the rise. Let us explore why humans long for redemption, how we find it, and how it reshapes the future we walk toward. What is redemption? Redemption is one of the oldest movements in the human heart. It lives beneath language, beneath culture, beneath the shifting ages of history. It is a quiet ache that rises when the life we imagined fractures, when the self we believed we were collapses, and when we stand before the mirror of our own becoming with a single question: what now? The search for redemption begins not in perfection, but in rupture. It emerges from the raw human experience of making mistakes, losing our way, hurting ourselves or others, and realizing that the path ahead must change. To understand redemption, we must first understand why humans cannot let the story end at the moment of falling. Across psychology, anthropology, neuroscience, and mythology, a pattern appears. Human beings are wired to seek coherence. We need our lives to form an arc, a shape, a narrative that makes sense. When something happens that fractures that arc, the psyche does not simply accept the break. It begins searching for a way to restore meaning, not to erase the fall, but to integrate it, to transform it into something that fits the larger shape of a life. This drive appears early in human development. Children, even before they understand morality, instinctively seek repair after conflict. A child who accidentally breaks a toy may try to fix it. A child who hurts a friend will often seek reconnection. Repair is not taught, it is inborn. The infant brain is shaped by cycles of rupture and repair, learning that relationships and experiences can fracture and then be rebuilt. These early experiences form the foundation of what later becomes the adult capacity for redemption. Anthropologists studying ancient cultures find that every society carries rituals of restoration, ceremonies of cleansing, acts of confession, rites of renewal. Even in communities without formal religion, there are processes through which individuals return to belonging after harm. This suggests something profound. Redemption is not only personal, but collective. Human groups survive because they create ways for people to come back from mistakes, to restore trust, and to reconnect with the community. Without this, groups fracture and fade. Philosophers describe redemption as the movement from alienation to coherence. Alienation occurs when a person becomes separated from their own values, identity, or sense of meaning. This separation may come from actions taken in fear, from trauma, from failure, from moral conflict, or from the slow erosion of one's inner world. Redemption is the return to oneself. It is the reconstruction of identity on a sturdier foundation. It is the transformation of raw pain into clarity, humility, and growth. Psychologically, redemption involves three layers. First, the recognition of the fall. Second, the emotional processing of what happened. And third, the rebuilding of the narrative. The recognition is often the hardest part. Humans resist admitting that something has broken because the admission forces the confrontation with vulnerability. But without this step, there can be no movement toward renewal. The second layer requires the courage to feel, to let guilt and grief and regret move through the body. And the third layer is where the transformation occurs. It is where the mind begins to recreate the story of the self, not by erasing what happened, but by understanding it differently. Neuroscience adds another dimension. When we speak of redemption, we are also speaking of neuroplasticity. The brain is constantly rewriting itself. Neural pathways shaped by fear, shame, or failure can reorganize. Circuits strengthened by regret can be replaced by circuits strengthened through responsibility and action. Redemption is not just emotional or moral, it is biological. The brain literally restructures itself as a person heals, repairs, and grows. There is also a cultural dimension. Throughout history, redemption has been represented in myth as a journey, a descent into darkness, a confrontation with truth, a return transformed. These stories reveal that humans across cultures perceive life as a cycle of falling and rising. The phoenix burns and is reborn. The hero descends into the underworld and returns with new understanding. The wanderer becomes lost and finds a new path. These stories endure because they mirror the internal human experience. They are psychological maps hidden in mythic imagery. Redemption also carries a moral dimension. When people harm others or violate their own values, they experience moral dissonance. The psyche seeks alignment, owning the past, making amends, repairing relationships, and acting differently in the future restores moral coherence. Without this restoration, the mind carries an unresolved tension that affects behavior, emotion, and identity. On an emotional level, redemption touches the deepest layers of the human experience. It evokes grief, guilt, longing, hope, courage, and tenderness. It requires vulnerability and honesty. It requires facing parts of oneself that were once avoided. It is not a comfortable journey, but it is a profoundly human one. And yet, redemption is also gentle. It does not demand perfection. It does not erase the past. It does not insist on certainty. Instead, it invites a gradual softening, a gradual turning toward the truth, a gradual acceptance of responsibility, a gradual rebuilding of trust in oneself and others. The pace of redemption is not dictated by force, but by willingness. As you listen to this unfolding story, you may notice your breath slowing, or your shoulders releasing tension, or your awareness settling into the quiet rhythm of the narrative. These moments of ease are not distractions. They are reminders that redemption unfolds through presence, through awareness, through the calm clarity that arises when the mind is not rushed. Humans long to rise after falling because the fall is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of transformation. The longing for redemption is the longing to become whole, to return to a self that feels true, to live in alignment with values, meaning, and purpose. This longing is universal because breaking is universal, and the possibility of rising again is woven into the fabric of human consciousness. Throughout this journey, we will explore the many layers of redemption, moving from biology to myth, from psychology to philosophy, from personal healing to cultural stories, and from the past we carry to the future we create. Redemption is not a single moment. It is a lifetime arc, a quiet evolution, a human birthright. And so this chapter stands as the first step in that long, ancient arc, a reminder that redemption is not reserved for the exceptional or the pure. It is available to every human being who has ever fallen, broken, or lost their way. It is the movement from fragmentation toward wholeness, from the ashes towards the light, from the person one was to the person one becomes. The biology of breaking. Breaking is not a metaphor. It is not only an emotional experience or a poetic description of suffering. It is a biological event, a full body shift, a neurochemical cascade, a physiological collapse under pressure that the mind then tries to interpret and narrate. When a person breaks emotionally or psychologically, the body breaks first. Long before the story of failure forms, long before guilt or shame arrives, the nervous system has already reached its threshold. In every human life, there are moments when stress becomes too heavy, when fear becomes too persistent, when grief becomes too deep, or when a sudden rupture overwhelms all available resources. At these points, the body initiates survival processes that have existed for hundreds of thousands of years. These processes are not moral judgments. They are not signs of weakness. They are ancient biological responses designed to protect life when threat becomes too intense. The sympathetic nervous system is the first to activate. It prepares the body for action. Heart rate increases. Breathing becomes shallow. Adrenaline releases into the bloodstream. Muscles tighten. Attention narrows to detect danger. This is the fight or flight response, a mechanism crafted through evolution to keep humans alive in a world filled with predators, conflict, and uncertainty. For brief moments, this system is a gift. It sharpens perception. It increases strength. It focuses energy. But when the stressor does not resolve, when the pressure continues for days, months, or years, the system begins to overload. Cortisol levels rise and remain elevated. The amygdala, the brain's alarm center, becomes hypersensitive. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for reasoning, emotional regulation, and long-term thinking, becomes compromised. People begin to feel reactive, overwhelmed, easily triggered, and emotionally volatile. Decision-making declines. Perspective narrows. The world begins to feel threatening, even when it is not. As stress accumulates, the brain shifts further. Sleep becomes disrupted. Memory becomes foggy. The nervous system loses its ability to return to baseline. Over time, this dysregulation creates the conditions for collapse. The human mind and body can endure extraordinary strain, but they are not infinite. When the load surpasses capacity, the system falters. In trauma studies, this moment is recognized as the threshold where the body transitions from activation to shutdown. When the threat feels inescapable, when the person has no sense of agency, when escape or defense becomes impossible, the parasympathetic collapse emerges. This is not the calm of relaxation. It is a freeze or dissociative response. Heart rate drops, muscles lose tension, awareness becomes foggy or distant. The person may feel disconnected from themselves, from others, or from reality. The mind protects itself by withdrawing its presence from the intolerable moment. This is breaking, not in the moral sense, not in the narrative sense, but in the biological sense. The organism has exceeded its limit. The body retreats to survive. When emotional collapse appears in daily life, a panic attack, a shutdown, a sense of numbness, the inability to function, it is often the nervous system signaling that it cannot hold anymore. This collapse can be triggered by trauma, by prolonged stress, by heartbreak, by failure, by moral injury, or by chronic emotional strain. It can also arise suddenly when a life event overwhelms everything that once felt stable. Understanding breaking through biology softens the judgment that people often place on themselves. Many individuals carry the belief that they should have handled things better, or been stronger, or stayed in control. But the nervous system is not governed by willpower. It is governed by evolution. When it reaches its limit, collapse is not a choice. It is an ancient response that has kept humans alive for millennia. In the deep layers of the brain, the systems responsible for survival operate independently of conscious thought. They respond faster than awareness. They detect threat before the mind interprets meaning, and they pull the entire body into patterns of protection. This is why people sometimes act in ways they do not understand during moments of crisis. The biological system moves first. The psychological narrative arrives later. Breaking is also influenced by developmental history. Early childhood experiences shape how the nervous system responds to stress. A child raised in an environment of instability, neglect, or emotional inconsistency may grow into an adult with a more sensitive alarm system. Their baseline may be higher, their threshold lower. This is not a flaw. It is an adaptation, a survival brilliance that once protected them but may later create vulnerability. Similarly, unresolved trauma remains stored in the nervous system. When a new stressor enters life, the old patterns reactivate. The body cannot always distinguish between past and present. What feels like an overreaction is often the nervous system recognizing a familiar threat. In this light, breaking becomes a message, a signal that something in the internal world needs attention, repair, or release. It is the nervous system saying, "I cannot continue like this. Something must change." Breaking is also an opportunity, not in a superficial or inspirational sense, but in a biological sense. A system under pressure becomes malleable. Neuroplasticity increases when old patterns fail. When the old story falls apart, the brain becomes more open to change, to new patterns, to new connections. The collapse of old neural pathways makes room for the formation of new ones. Crisis, in this sense, is a catalyst for transformation. From a human perspective, breaking feels like absolute failure. But from a physiological perspective, it is a doorway, a moment where the system is forced to reevaluate and reorganize. In the quiet after collapse, the nervous system begins slowly rebuilding. It searches for stability, safety, and coherence, and it is in this rebuilding that redemption begins. As the body starts to settle, even slightly, the breath deepens, muscles soften, awareness returns. The prefrontal cortex regains strength. The mind begins to process events with greater clarity. In these moments of return, change becomes possible. The emotional landscape becomes navigable again. Responsibility becomes reachable. Healing becomes imaginable. This chapter, then, is not about failure, but about understanding. It reveals that breaking is not a flaw, but a physiological threshold. A moment when the biology of survival demands a shift. A moment when the narrative we have lived so far can no longer carry us. A moment where a new chapter becomes possible. And as the nervous system slowly rises from collapse, a quiet space opens. A space where the story of redemption can begin to form. A space where the mind can ask, "What now?" A space where the rise can begin. The fall. The fall is one of the most intimate and disorienting experiences a human being can endure. It is not simply a mistake or a failure. It is the moment when something inside the self fractures so deeply that the entire inner landscape shifts. The fall arrives in many forms: a wrong decision, a betrayal, a collapse of character, a moment of fear that leads to harm, a slow drift away from one's values, a sudden loss that shatters life as it was known. Sometimes the fall is caused by external events. Sometimes it is caused by one's own hand. Often it is both. Regardless of its source, the fall carries a weight that settles into the body and psyche. It is the moment when the person we believed we were becomes misaligned with the person we see now. The fall separates the self from its own story. It creates a fracture between identity and action, between intention and outcome, between hope and reality. This fracture is the birthplace of guilt, regret, and shame. To understand the fall, we must understand guilt. Guilt arises when a person recognizes that they have violated their own moral code. It is not imposed from outside, it emerges from the inside. Humans carry internal value systems shaped by upbringing, culture, personal experience, and the innate moral intuitions that all social species possess. When an action or inaction contradicts these values, guilt appears as an internal signal. It is the psyche's way of drawing attention to a misalignment that needs repair. Guilt, in its constructive form, can guide growth. It can illuminate what matters most. It can invite responsibility. It can inspire change. But guilt can also become heavy, distorted, or overwhelming when combined with shame. Shame goes deeper. Shame does not say, "I did something wrong." Shame says, "I am something wrong." It is not about behavior, but identity. It dissolves the boundary between action and self, creating a sense that one's entire being is flawed, damaged, or unworthy. Shame is one of the most painful emotions a human can experience. It activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. It generates the urge to hide, withdraw, and disappear. If guilt asks for repair, shame asks for invisibility. Regret weaves itself through both guilt and shame. Regret is the longing for an alternate past, the mind replaying events, imagining different choices, trying to rewrite what cannot be changed. Regret is natural, but when it becomes obsessive, it traps the mind in a loop of longing for a version of oneself that no longer exists, a loop of trying to negotiate with time itself. The fall is the moment these emotions converge. It is the psychological earthquake that reveals what lies beneath the surface. When the narrative of the self collapses, all the unhealed wounds, unresolved conflicts, and hidden fears rise like dust from broken stone. The fall exposes truths that were once buried. It forces a confrontation with parts of the psyche that the individual may have avoided for years. And yet, the fall is not sudden for everyone. For many, the fall is gradual, a slow erosion of inner strength, a drip of compromise, a quiet drift away from values, a series of small choices that accumulate over time until the person wakes one day and realizes they have slipped far from the self they recognize. This slow fall can be even more disorienting because there is no clear moment to point to, no single event to explain the fracture, only a gradual fading of integrity, direction, or clarity. Regardless of its speed, the fall brings with it a shift in identity. Humans experience themselves not only as bodies and minds, but as stories. When the story breaks, the identity breaks with it. This identity fracture is often what makes the fall feel unbearable. The self becomes divided. One part clings to the previous identity. The other part sees the undeniable truth. These two selves collide, creating tension, confusion, and emotional turmoil. The psyche attempts to defend itself. Some people minimize what happened. Some rationalize it. Some blame others. Some numb themselves. Some run from the truth. These defenses are not signs of moral failure. They are signs of psychological overwhelm. The mind protects itself when the truth feels too painful to face directly. But defenses cannot hold forever. Eventually, the truth seeps through the cracks. The person must look at what happened, at what they did, at what was done to them, at who they have become. This moment of confrontation is terrifying. It is also necessary. It marks the threshold between the fall and the potential for transformation. Emotionally, the fall can feel like being cut loose from the world, like all grounding has vanished, like the future has dissolved. Many people describe the fall as a free descent with no sense of direction or stability. Others describe it as a fog, a heaviness, an emptiness. Some feel grief, some feel panic, some feel numb. The emotional landscape of the fall is wide, but the common thread is disorientation. The old self cannot continue. The new self has not yet emerged. This liminal state is the heart of the human journey. It is the space between what was and what will be. Ancient cultures understood this profoundly. Many rites of passage begin with a symbolic fall, a stripping away, a descent, a letting go of what was known. This descent mirrors the psychological fall that occurs naturally in human life. It is the emptying before renewal, the unraveling before reformation. From a neurological perspective, the fall often coincides with a shift in brain activity. The stress response intensifies. The prefrontal cortex becomes less effective. Emotional circuits become dominant. The brain enters a state where old patterns break down, but new patterns have not yet formed. This state is deeply uncomfortable, but it is also the gateway through which transformation emerges. In the middle of the fall, the mind often searches for escape, for a way back to the old self. But the old self cannot be recovered. The fall marks a threshold that cannot be reversed. It is the point at which the only path forward is through the emotions, through the truth, through the grief, through the uncertainty, through the shadow itself. And yet, even in this descent, there is a quiet strength, a small hidden ember that remains unbroken, a part of the self that watches, that observes, that endures. This observing self does not fall. It is the foundation on which the rebuilt identity will one day stand. It is the part of the psyche that remains intact when everything else shatters. It is the silent reminder that the fall is not the end of the story. As the person descends, there may be moments of stillness, moments when the breath settles, moments when awareness shifts gently inward. These small pauses are not interruptions. They are anchors. They allow the psyche to step back from the storm, even briefly, and recognize that something within remains steady. The fall prepares the ground for transformation. It strips away illusions. It breaks patterns that no longer serve. It reveals the truth that must be faced. It opens the space where redemption begins. This chapter ends not in resolution, but in descent, in the quiet recognition that the fall, painful as it is a necessary part of the human story. A chapter that every person, in some form, must one day walk through. A chapter that leads, inevitably, toward the shadow and towards the possibility of rising again. The shadow confronted. The moment comes when running is no longer possible, when distractions lose their power, when the mind grows tired of its own evasions and the truth stands quietly in front of everything else. This is the confrontation with the shadow, the part of the human psyche that holds all that has been avoided, denied, hidden, or deemed unacceptable. It is not darkness in the moral sense. It is darkness in the literal sense, the unlit chamber of the inner world, waiting to be acknowledged. Every human being carries a shadow. It forms early in life. Children learn quickly which feelings are welcomed and which are rejected. Anger, fear, jealousy, sadness, desire, vulnerability. Many of these emotions become tucked away because they were too overwhelming or were not mirrored safely by caregivers. Over time, the child adapts by pushing these parts out of awareness, not because they are wrong, but because the environment did not know how to hold them. As the child grows, the shadow grows too. It holds not only emotions, but memories, impulses, fears, wounds, and internalized beliefs. It holds the parts of the self that do not fit the image one wishes to present to the world. It holds ambitions that felt too dangerous, emotions that felt too intense, and truths that felt too inconvenient. The fall makes the shadow visible. When the story of the self breaks, the parts that were once hidden rise to the surface. The person who believed themselves to be composed, morally strong, or invulnerable may suddenly see anger they never acknowledged, fear they always denied, or patterns they once justified. This can be unsettling. The shadow does not reveal itself gently. It reveals itself with raw honesty. To confront the shadow is to look directly at the parts of yourself you once refused to see. Not to punish them, not to reject them, but to understand them. Because every shadow part began as a survival strategy. Anger protected a boundary that was never defended. Fear guarded against loss. Perfectionism compensated for not feeling safe enough to fail. Withdrawal protected the self from disappointment. Every shadow behavior, even the destructive ones, originates from an unmet need or an unresolved pain. This understanding does not remove responsibility, it clarifies it. The shadow is not an excuse for harm, it is an explanation for its origin. When a person confronts their shadow, they gain the capacity to change their behavior from a place of awareness instead of unconscious reaction. The confrontation with the shadow is often emotional. Shame may rise, grief may swell, anger may burst through the surface. People sometimes fear that if they open the door to these emotions, they will be consumed by them. But what consumes a person is not emotion itself, but years of avoidance. When the truth is finally faced, the emotions that appear are often less overwhelming than the fear of facing them. Psychologically, confronting the shadow requires a shift in posture, a softening, not a tightening, a willingness to sit with discomfort, a willingness to breathe through the storm rather than brace against it. Gentle awareness becomes a tool. The breath becomes a stabilizer. Moments of stillness become safe places from which to observe the truth. Many people imagine the shadow confrontation as a dramatic event, but in reality, it often arrives quietly. A late-night moment of clarity, a conversation that touches a buried wound, a memory resurfacing unexpectedly, a realization whispered in the silence of a long walk, a sense of finally seeing oneself without distortion. These small, intimate thresholds are where the deepest transformation begins. Neuroscience shows that when a person brings conscious awareness to a painful memory or truth, activity in the amygdala decreases while the prefrontal cortex becomes more engaged. This means that awareness itself begins to regulate emotional intensity. Facing the shadow literally calms the brain. It creates space between the truth and the emotional reaction to it. It allows the person to move from reactivity toward understanding. Culturally, the shadow has been represented in countless myths. The dragon the hero must face, the monster lurking in the cave, the underworld journey into darkness. These stories reflect an ancient psychological truth. The greatest treasure, wisdom, strength, renewal, lies on the other side of confronting what terrifies us most. The dragon guards the gold because the gold cannot be reached without moving through fear. The shadow also holds unclaimed potential, parts of the self that were never allowed to grow. Creativity pushed aside, desire silenced, confidence suffocated, healthy anger buried, intuition ignored. These are not negative traits. They are simply traits that did not find safety in childhood or early life. When the shadow is confronted, these dormant strengths begin to awaken. And yet, confronting the shadow also means seeing the harm one has caused, seeing the moments where fear guided decisions, where defensiveness created distance, where ego blocked connection, where avoidance created consequences. This is the most painful part of the confrontation. It requires honesty without self-torture, responsibility without self-condemnation. Some people respond to this truth by collapsing into shame. Others respond by turning away. But redemption requires neither collapse nor avoidance. It requires presence, the capacity to say, I see what is here. I take responsibility for what is mine. I will learn from this. I will do better. In this confrontation, the breath often becomes an anchor. A slow exhale softens the body. A quiet inhale grounds awareness. These physiological cues signal safety to the nervous system, which allows the psyche to stay with the truth rather than retreat into panic or denial. A moment of calm between thoughts allows difficult emotions to settle, like sediment sinking in water, revealing greater clarity. The confrontation with the shadow also reveals the origins of suffering. Many destructive behaviors, harmful choices, or self-sabotaging patterns did not begin in malice. They began in pain. They began in confusion. They began in childhood wounds. They began in states of overwhelm. Seeing this truth brings compassion, not as a way to escape accountability, but as a way to understand the human complexity behind every fall. With this clarity comes the first subtle shift of redemption. The moment when the person realizes that they are not simply a villain in their own story. They are a human being who has suffered, struggled, and acted from wounds not yet healed. This realization opens the doorway to change. It enables the person to take responsibility without drowning in self-hatred. It allows growth to emerge from understanding rather than punishment. And slowly, the shadow becomes less intimidating. It becomes a landscape rather than a monster, a map rather than a prison, a teacher rather than an enemy. The parts once feared become integrated. The emotions once avoided become understood. The narratives once repeated automatically begin to shift. The shadow confrontation is the turning point, the moment when the descent begins to pivot toward the possibility of rising. It does not erase the past. It does not undo what happened, but it reshapes the inner world. It brings coherence where there was fragmentation. It brings awareness where there was numbness. It brings choice where there was reactivity. And in this new clarity, the person begins to see that the fall was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a deeper truth, a deeper transformation, a deeper movement toward redemption. Ancient redemption myths. Long before humans understood trauma, psychology, or neurobiology, they understood redemption, not as a scientific concept, but as a pattern, an echo in the human spirit, a cycle woven into the rhythm of existence. Ancient cultures observed that people fall, break, descend into darkness, and rise again transformed. And so they created stories vast, symbolic, poetic landscapes to map this journey long before written language captured it. These myths were not entertainment. They were instruction. They were mirrors held up to the psyche. They were maps of human transformation encoded in symbols so that every generation could find its way through darkness. When people did not have the vocabulary to describe trauma or shame or internal fragmentation, they used imagery, fires, ashes, underworlds, monsters, storms, labyrinths to express the emotional terrain of redemption. One of the most enduring symbols is the phoenix, the radiant bird that dies in flames and rises from its own ashes. This myth appears in multiple cultures: ancient Egypt, Greek mythology, Persian traditions, early Christian writings, and even indigenous stories far across the world. The phoenix, embodies the essence of transformation. Not a return to the old self, but the creation of a new one. It burns, it collapses, it becomes ash, and from that ash, something stronger emerges. The fire is not punishment, it is purification. The ashes are not failure, they are the raw material for rebirth. The Phoenix myth teaches that redemption requires a death of the old self. Not a physical death, but a symbolic one. The death of illusions, the death of self-deception, the death of old patterns that can no longer sustain life. People often resist this internal death, fearing the loss of identity. But ancient storytellers understood something profound. Renewal requires release. The fire clears what cannot be carried into the next chapter. Another deep story of redemption is the descent into the underworld. This theme appears across cultures in Greek mythology with Orpheus, Demeter, and Persephone, in Mesopotamian mythology with Inanna, in Egyptian mythology with Osiris, in Norse mythology with Odin and Baldur, in early Christian writings describing Christ's descent into death before resurrection. In every version of the underworld journey, the pattern is the same: descent, confrontation, transformation, and return. The hero enters a realm where ordinary rules do not apply, a place of darkness, danger, and truth, a place where the psyche cannot hide. In modern terms, the underworld represents the unconscious, the painful memories, the unresolved wounds, the fears that shape behavior, the truths too heavy to face in the daylight world. The descent is not a punishment, it is a necessity. The hero cannot rise until they have faced what lies below. Ancient myths reveal a truth psychology later confirmed. You cannot heal what you will not confront. You cannot transform what you refuse to see. You cannot rise until you have descended. Consider the story of Inanna, one of the oldest recorded myths. She descends into the underworld, stripped of her garments, symbols, and power at each gate. This stripping is symbolic of what happens in the psychological fall. Everything that once gave identity titles, roles, defenses is removed. Inanna reaches the underworld naked, vulnerable, and unprotected. There she faces her shadow, the queen of the underworld. She dies, and then she rises, not as she was, but transformed. This myth reflects the internal process of redemption with uncanny accuracy. The stripping of illusions, the confrontation with the shadow, the symbolic death of the old self, the emergence of a new, strengthened identity. Ancient cultures understood that every true transformation demands that the old self die so that the new one can be born. In Greek mythology, the underworld journey is often tied to love and loss. Orpheus descends to rescue Eurydice. Demeter descends in search of Persephone. These stories symbolize the emotional depths humans experience when they lose what they love. Redemption in these stories is not just about moral repair, but about surviving grief, navigating loss, and finding a path back to life after being submerged in sorrow. In many indigenous traditions, the underworld is not a place of evil, but a place of wisdom, a realm where ancestors speak, where truth resides, where one gains clarity. Redemption in these cultures is not about punishment or reward. It is about balance. When a person loses their way, they undergo a ritual descent to reconnect with their origins, to remember who they are, to restore harmony between self, community, and nature. The motif of the hero's journey also contains redemption at its core. Joseph Campbell famously described this pattern: a call to adventure, a descent into trials, a crisis, a transformation, and a return with newfound wisdom. The crisis is always a form of failure, loss, or breaking. The transformation is always a form of redemption. The return is always a reintegration, bringing the lessons learned in darkness back into the world of light. Mythology reveals something essential. Redemption is not the erasure of the past. It is the integration of the past into a wiser self. The hero does not return as who they were. They return as who they became through suffering, courage, and truth. The fall becomes part of their power. The wounds become part of their strength. The descent becomes the foundation for their rise. Even the story of the flood, found in numerous cultures, holds a redemption arc. Civilization collapses under the weight of corruption or imbalance. Waters cleanse the world, and from the destruction, new life emerges. Psychologically, this reflects the process of emotional cleansing, the flood of grief, pain, or truth that clears what was stagnant. The waters are destructive, but they nourish the soil for new growth. In Hindu mythology, the god Shiva destroys so that creation can begin anew. The cycle of creation, preservation, and destruction mirrors the cycle of the psyche. A self must dissolve before it can be reborn. Redemption is not linear. It is cyclical. It is part of the rhythm of existence itself. Ancient myths were shared around fires, spoken in temples, carved into stone, sung in rituals. They were reminders that suffering is not meaningless, that breaking is not the end, and that darkness is part of the journey toward light. They taught communities that every person will one day fall, descend, face their shadow, and rise. That this process is not shameful, but sacred. These myths still resonate because the human psyche has not changed. People still break, people still descend. People still face dragons now internal rather than external. People still emerge transformed. The stories endure because they reflect fundamental truths about the structure of being human. When someone today experiences a fall, they often feel alone. They feel as though no one has ever carried such weight or navigated such darkness. But mythology reminds us that countless generations before us have walked the same path. Their stories are our stories. Their descent is our descent. Their rise is our rise. In the light of these ancient narratives, the modern journey of redemption becomes less isolating and more inevitable. The fall is not a detour, it is the path. The descent is not failure, it is initiation. The shadow is not an enemy, it is a guide. And the rise is not accidental, it is the natural outcome of facing what lies within. In this way, ancient myths form a quiet reassurance running through time, a reminder that the arc of redemption is older than memory, older than language, older than civilization, and that every person who walks through darkness toward light is participating in one of the most ancient human traditions, the sacred journey of falling, confronting, transforming, and returning renewed. Religion and redemption. Redemption is woven into the spiritual imagination of humanity. Long before psychology offered frameworks for healing, and long before neuroscience revealed the mechanics of transformation, religion gave language to the deepest human longing, the longing to be cleansed, forgiven, renewed, restored, the longing to rise after falling, the longing to return to wholeness. Across cultures and centuries, religions created rituals, stories, and practices that reflect this universal need. They did not invent redemption. They recognized it. They gave it shape. They turned the inner arc of psychological transformation into ceremonies of meaning, community, and sacred belonging. To explore redemption through religion is to explore the architecture of the human heart. In Judaism, redemption is a process of return. The Hebrew word teshuvah means turning back, returning to one's truest self, and repairing one's relationship with the divine and with people. Teshuvah is not simply an apology. It is an honest confrontation with one's actions, an acknowledgement of responsibility, a sincere transformation of behavior, and a deep recommitment to one's values. It is redemption as moral repair. The Jewish tradition understands humans as fundamentally capable of change. It rejects the idea that a person's worst action defines their entire identity. Instead, it teaches that renewal is always possible through reflection, humility, and courageous action. In this tradition, redemption is not a gift given to the perfect. It is a path open to the flawed, the wounded, and the repentant, a path that begins with facing truth. In Christianity, redemption takes a more dramatic form. It is the story of sacrifice, forgiveness, and rebirth. The central narrative, the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, is a symbolic map of the human process of falling, breaking, dying to the old self, and rising transformed. The cross represents the unbearable weight of suffering, guilt, and moral failure. The descent into death mirrors the psychological descent into the shadow. And the resurrection symbolizes the possibility of a new identity, transcending the brokenness that came before. This narrative resonates not only because of its theology, but because it mirrors the internal experience of redemption. Humans often feel crucified by their own mistakes. They feel buried under the weight of shame. They feel as though their old identity has died. And yet, in the process of reckoning, something new emerges. A new self rises from the ruins of the old. Christianity gives this inner transformation a cosmic shape, turning personal redemption into a symbolic rebirth that reflects both suffering and hope. Islam also speaks deeply to the theme of redemption. In the Quran, God is described as the most forgiving, the most merciful, the one who welcomes repentance without limit. Redemption here is not only about forgiveness from the divine, but about purification of the heart. The Arabic word tawbah means to return, to turn away from what harms, and to move toward what aligns with truth and goodness. It is a process of self-examination, responsibility, and renewed commitment to living with integrity. In Islam, redemption is not passive. It requires sincere intention, honest reflection, and a willingness to repair harm where possible. But it also emphasizes compassion, the understanding that humans are imperfect and that missteps are part of the human journey. The path back is always open, no matter how far one has wandered. Redemption, in this view, is as close as the next breath. In Buddhism, redemption is framed as liberation from suffering, not through external forgiveness, but through inner understanding. The Four Noble Truths reveal that suffering arises from attachment, illusion, and ignorance, and that it can be transformed through insight. Meditation becomes a tool for confronting the shadow. Compassion becomes the force that dissolves shame. Mindfulness becomes the bridge between pain and clarity. Redemption in Buddhism is not about erasing the past, but about seeing it with clarity, releasing the stories that imprison the mind, and cultivating wisdom that transforms suffering into awareness. The process is profoundly psychological. It involves noticing the breath, observing the mind's patterns, and gently unraveling the knots of craving and fear. Redemption here is awakening, returning to the truth of who you are beneath the layers of conditioning. Hinduism offers another profound lens. The cycle of karma describes the consequences of actions, but it is not a system of punishment. It is a system of growth. Every action shapes the soul's journey, and every misstep becomes an opportunity for learning and transformation. Redemption emerges through Dharma, living in alignment with one's purpose and values, and through devotion, selfless action, and inner purification. In Hindu philosophy, the self is not permanently stained by wrongdoing. The true self, the Atman, remains pure. Redemption is the process of clearing the clouds that obscure this inner radiance. It is the return to one's essential nature. Indigenous spiritual traditions across the world also hold redemption as a communal process. When harm occurs, the goal is not exile, but restoration. Through ceremony, storytelling, confession, and communal support, individuals reintegrate into the tribe. This reflects a deep understanding that humans heal in connection, not isolation. Redemption is not a solitary struggle, but a shared journey. In some Native American traditions, healing circles allow individuals to speak their truth, take responsibility, and receive guidance. In African spiritual systems, rituals of cleansing and reconciliation restore harmony between the person, the ancestors, and the community. In many Polynesian cultures, the concept of ho'oponopono centers on forgiveness, truth-telling, and emotional repair, a collective practice of making things right. These traditions recognize something modern psychology has confirmed. Humans are wired for belonging. Redemption is not simply internal. It requires the presence, witnessing, and acceptance of others. It is through community that people find the courage to face their shadows and the strength to rise again. Across all these religious traditions, a common thread emerges. Redemption is never about perfection. It is about transformation. It is about truth. It is about returning to alignment with one's values, one's community, one's purpose, or one's deeper nature. It is about becoming honest with oneself. It is about healing what was harmed. It is about rising, not as the person who fell, but as the person who learned, suffered, and transcended. In these spiritual narratives, redemption is a sacred journey, a journey that acknowledges the reality of human imperfection while affirming the possibility of profound renewal. Whether through sacrifice, confession, meditation, ritual, or reconnection, each path leads toward the same place. A self that is more integrated, more awake, more aligned with meaning, more compassionate, more aware. And in this sacred architecture of redemption, humanity finds reassurance. The reassurance that falling does not end the story. The reassurance that every brokenness carries the seed of transformation. The reassurance that the journey through darkness has always been part of the human soul's deepest purpose. The psychology of responsibility. Responsibility is one of the most transformative forces in the human psyche. It is the hinge on which redemption turns. Many people imagine responsibility as a burden, a weight they must carry, or a punishment for their mistakes. But psychologically, responsibility is liberation. It is the moment when a person stops running from their past and begins shaping their future. To understand why responsibility is so powerful, we must first understand what happens internally when a person avoids it. Avoidance may offer temporary relief, but it fractures the psyche. It creates distance between who a person is and who they believe themselves to be. This distance breeds anxiety, guilt, shame, and inner conflict. The mind becomes filled with unfinished stories, unresolved emotions, and unspoken truths. The weight of avoidance grows heavier with time. Responsibility closes this distance. It brings the self back into alignment. It restores integrity. When someone finally acknowledges what they have done, or what they have neglected, denied, or run from, the internal tension begins to ease. The nervous system shifts. The body softens. The mind regains clarity. People often fear that taking responsibility will make them feel worse, but in truth, it brings a strange and unexpected relief. It restores coherence. Responsibility is not self-condemnation. It is not a collapse into shame. It is not the belief that one is irredeemable. Responsibility is an act of courage. It requires honesty. It requires humility. It requires the willingness to see oneself without defense or distortion. It is the moment when the person says, quietly and clearly, "This is what happened. This is what I did. This is what I failed to do. And this is what I must now change." In narrative psychology, responsibility is the turning point in a person's life story. Before responsibility, the narrative is defragmented. After responsibility, the narrative becomes whole again. It gains direction. It regains authorship. When a person takes responsibility, they reclaim their agency. They are no longer a passive character swept along by circumstance, emotion, or fear. They become the author of the next chapter. This shift is not simply emotional, it is neurological. When someone takes responsibility, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain involved in planning, reasoning, and self-regulation, becomes more active. The amygdala's grip loosens. The nervous system moves from fight or flight toward a more regulated state. Responsibility literally reorganizes the brain. It strengthens neural pathways associated with long-term thinking, empathy, and moral decision-making. This is why responsibility feels clarifying. It leads to a sense of groundedness, a sense of direction, a sense of integrity. It is one of the few psychological processes that simultaneously brings relief, pain, humility, and empowerment. However, responsibility is often misunderstood. Some people believe that taking responsibility means taking blame for everything. But true responsibility is discerning. It is the capacity to separate what was within one's control from what was not. It acknowledges the complexity of life. It recognizes that harm can occur not only from malice, but from fear, immaturity, confusion, trauma, and misguided attempts to protect oneself. True responsibility does not demand ownership of things that were never one's fault. Childhood wounds, systemic pressures, and the failures of others do not belong to the individual. But the effects of these wounds, the patterns they created, the behaviors they shaped, do become one's responsibility to understand and transform. Not because one caused the original pain, but because only the individual can heal it now. This distinction matters deeply. Without it, responsibility becomes self-blame. With it, responsibility becomes empowerment. In moral psychology, responsibility is tied to the concept of moral repair, the process through which individuals mend the fractures in their inner moral world. When someone acts against their values, they experience moral dissonance, a painful tension between who they are and what they have done. Responsibility is the way to resolve this dissonance. It restores internal alignment. Moral repair also involves recognition of the impact one's actions had on others, not as a performance, not as a plea for forgiveness, but as an honest acknowledgement of the pain others experienced. This recognition is essential. It opens the door to empathy. It softens defensiveness. It allows the heart to expand and include the perspective of others. Empathy in this context is not self-punishment. It is not drowning in guilt. It is the act of understanding the reality of another person's experience. This understanding is healing. It rebuilds connection. It repairs relationships. It restores trust. Taking responsibility also shifts the person's relationship with their own past. Instead of trying to escape it, they begin to integrate it. They turn toward the pain. They learn from it. They allow it to inform their future actions. The past becomes a teacher rather than a prison. Throughout this process, the breath becomes a companion. During moments of painful clarity, a deep exhale can soften the body. During moments of remorse, a gentle inhale can bring steadiness. These small physiological shifts signal safety to the nervous system, allowing the person to face difficult truths without being overwhelmed. Responsibility is also a form of love. It is the recognition that the people harmed by one's actions matter. It is the commitment to do better, to become someone trustworthy, to rebuild what was broken, to stand with honesty in the presence of pain. Cultures across the world recognize responsibility as a sacred act. In indigenous traditions, speaking truth before the community restores harmony. In Eastern philosophies, acknowledging one's actions is part of karmic purification. In Abrahamic religions, confession and repentance are pathways to redemption. In ancient Greek culture, taking responsibility was tied to honor. In modern psychology, it is tied to healing. Despite these cultural differences, the underlying truth remains the same. Responsibility is the bridge between the fall and the rise, between shame and renewal, between fragmentation and coherence, between the old self and the emerging one. And yet, responsibility is not instantaneous. It unfolds slowly, like dawn. First, there is recognition, then acceptance, then emotional processing, then understanding, then change, then repair. Each step brings the person closer to integrity, closer to redemption. When a person finally embraces responsibility, something in them shifts. The internal war quiets. The defensive walls soften. The mind becomes clearer. The heart becomes steadier. A new sense of direction emerges. Responsibility does not erase the past, but it transforms its meaning. The past becomes part of a larger arc, a story not of permanent failure, but of human transformation. In this way, responsibility becomes the foundation of redemption. It is the moment a person stops falling and begins rising. The moment when the downward spiral reverses direction. The moment the future opens again. And with responsibility comes the next chapter. The work of emotional repair, the slow, patient rebuilding of the inner world. Emotional repair. Emotional repair is the quiet, patient unfolding of healing after the fall. It is the work of tending to the wounds that responsibility reveals. It is the slow stitching together of a self that has been torn, frayed, or shattered. While responsibility restores alignment between action and identity, emotional repair restores safety, coherence, and stability within the inner world. This stage of redemption is not loud or dramatic. It does not announce itself. It unfolds in whispers, in late-night reflections, in softened breaths, in moments of unexpected tenderness toward oneself. Emotional repair is the part of the journey most people never see because it takes place within the private chambers of the human heart. To begin emotional repair, the psyche must first acknowledge the pain it carries. Not the pain of guilt or shame alone, but the deeper emotional injuries that sit beneath them. The grief of losing a version of oneself, the sorrow of harming someone else, the confusion of being disconnected from one's values, the loneliness that follows collapse. These emotions must be felt, not avoided. They must be allowed to move through the body like waves. Grief is often the first wave. It is the grief for what could have been, for the future that will never exist in its original form, for the version of oneself that is now gone. Grief is not weakness. It is a sign that the heart is reopening. It is the nervous system releasing what was suppressed. It is the first breath after being underwater. Grief requires space. It requires gentleness. It requires the willingness to sit with uncertainty. People often fear grief because they think it will swallow them whole. But grief is a process, not a prison. When given compassion and time, it moves, it shifts, it softens. It leaves behind clarity, humility, and a deeper connection to one's humanity. After grief comes the integration of pain. Integration does not mean forgetting. It means understanding. It means placing the painful experience within the wider context of one's life story. Humans are narrative creatures. We make meaning through storytelling. When a traumatic or painful event remains unintegrated, it sits outside the narrative. It becomes a jagged edge, constantly reopening. Emotional repair softens that edge. It brings the experience into coherence. One key aspect of integration is acknowledging the emotions that were previously hidden or denied. Anger that went unexpressed, fear that was never spoken, sadness that was swallowed. These emotions become stored in the body. They shape behavior unconsciously. They create tension, anxiety, and emotional numbness. When a person turns toward these emotions with curiosity rather than judgment, the body begins to release them. The nervous system uncoils. Another aspect of emotional repair is self-compassion. Many people believe self-compassion is indulgence or excuse, but self-compassion is the opposite. It is accountability with kindness. It is the ability to say, I made mistakes, and I am still worthy of healing. It is the recognition that one can hold responsibility and self-love at the same time. Self-compassion allows the psyche to heal without collapsing under self-hatred. It is the medicine that transforms guilt into growth and shame into humility. In neuroscience, self-compassion activates neural circuits associated with safety and connection. It reduces activation in the brain's threat system and strengthens pathways involved in emotional regulation. This means that treating oneself with kindness is not sentimental. It is a practical tool for healing. It calms the body, supports neural rewiring, and deepens emotional resilience. Emotional repair also requires regulation. When emotions are intense, the nervous system can become overwhelmed. Repair involves learning how to soothe oneself through breath, through grounding, through movement, through connection with others, through moments of quiet stillness that allow the mind to settle. These practices are not spiritual abstractions. They are physiological mechanisms that signal safety to the body. As emotional repair unfolds, relationships with others become part of the healing process. Humans heal through connection. When someone experiences emotional pain, the presence of another person, a friend, a partner, a therapist, a mentor, can provide a sense of safety that the individual cannot easily create alone. Being seen, heard, and understood by another activates the social regulation system of the brain. It reduces distress. It restores a sense of belonging. But emotional repair is also solitary. There are wounds that only the individual can sit with, emotions that only they can feel, insights that only they can discover. This solitude is not abandonment. It is inward listening, a chance to meet oneself with honesty and care. Another important element of emotional repair is the release of self-protective patterns. These patterns, often formed in childhood or during times of overwhelm, they helped the individual survive, but they may no longer serve. Some people push others away to avoid vulnerability. Some cling too tightly to avoid loss. Some numb themselves to avoid pain. Some react with anger to avoid fear. Emotional repair involves recognizing these patterns without judgment and gently shifting them over time. Forgiveness also plays a role, though it unfolds slowly. Forgiveness is not forgetting or dismissing the impact of harm. It is not absolving oneself prematurely. It is the gradual release of self-condemnation. It is the understanding that a human being is more than their worst moment. Forgiveness softens the grip of shame. It opens the door for growth. It allows the person to move forward without dragging the past like a chain. Throughout emotional repair, the inner world becomes quieter, not silent, not empty, but clearer. The noise of guilt softens. The intensity of shame fades. The storms of grief become less frequent. A sense of steadiness emerges, a sense of inner space, a sense of groundedness. These sensations are signs that the psyche is reorganizing itself, that new pathways are forming, that healing is taking root. When emotional repair reaches a stable point, something unexpected happens. The person begins to feel gratitude, not for the fall itself, but for the insight it brought, for the strength it revealed, for the humility it cultivated, for the compassion it awakened. Gratitude is one of the final signs of emotional integration. It signals that the pain has transformed into wisdom. This transformation does not erase the past, but it reshapes it. The fall becomes part of the story, not the end of it. The pain becomes part of the identity, not the definition of it. Emotional repair allows the person to carry their past with dignity rather than shame. And in this renewed inner landscape, the stage is set for the next phase of redemption, the biological transformation that accompanies emotional healing, the rewiring of the brain, the emergence of new possibility, the beginning of a new self, neuroplasticity and transformation. Transformation is not only emotional, spiritual, or psychological. It is biological. It is physical. It is the reshaping of the brain itself. When a person moves through the fall, confronts the shadow, takes responsibility, and begins emotional repair, something profound begins unfolding beneath consciousness. The neural architecture of the mind starts to reorganize. This reorganization is the biological foundation of redemption. The human brain is not fixed. It is dynamic, adaptive, fluid. From birth until death, neural pathways strengthen, weaken, grow, shrink, rewire, and reorganize based on experience. This capacity for change is called neuroplasticity, and it is the reason humans can transform. Every new thought, new behavior, new insight, and new emotional experience leaves a trace in the brain's circuitry. These traces, when repeated, become new patterns, new habits, new possibilities. For a person in the early phases of redemption, neuroplasticity is both challenge and opportunity. The brain has been shaped by the fall, by trauma, by guilt, by emotional pain, by defensive patterns learned over years. These patterns have physical roots in the brain. Neural circuits associated with fear, shame, avoidance, or impulsivity may be highly developed. Circuits associated with patience, compassion, self-regulation, or long-term thinking may be weaker. This imbalance is not a flaw. it is learning. It is adaptation to past environments. The brain shapes itself around what it has repeatedly experienced. If a person lived in unpredictability, their brain adapted to fear. If they lived in judgment, their brain adapted to self-criticism. If they lived in chaos, their brain adapted to hypervigilance. The nervous system is loyal. It learns whatever it must to protect the organism. Redemption begins when these old circuits stop serving the present, when the person recognizes that the patterns built for survival are now creating suffering. At this point, the brain enters a state of heightened plasticity. The fall destabilizes old pathways. Emotional repair creates openness. Responsibility increases awareness. All of these changes combine to create fertile ground for new neural growth. Think of the brain like a forest. Years of repeated behavior carve trails. The most frequently used trails become wide and clear. Rarely used trails become overgrown. When a person is in the depths of guilt or shame, the trails of self-criticism become deeply carved. When they avoid responsibility, the trails of denial strengthen. When they numb emotion, the trails of emotional suppression widen. But when responsibility awakens, when truth is faced, when emotional repair begins, the person starts walking new trails. At first, these trails are thin, fragile, only faintly visible. But each repetition strengthens them. Each moment of self-awareness widens the path. Each compassionate thought reinforces the connection. Each regulated breath stabilizes the nervous system. Slowly, new neural pathways form. The prefrontal cortex plays a central role in this transformation. This region of the brain governs decision-making, impulse control, emotional regulation, planning, empathy, and long-term thinking. It is the seat of mature human behavior. During the fall, the prefrontal cortex is often weakened by stress. The amygdala dominates. Fear, guilt, or shame overtake reasoning. But as emotional repair strengthens the internal landscape, the prefrontal cortex re-engages. It becomes the conductor again. It regulates the emotional circuits. It quiets the alarm system. It restores clarity. This return of prefrontal functioning is one of the most important signs of redemption. It shows the brain is shifting from survival mode to growth mode. The nervous system begins to stabilize. The body moves from threat to safety. The mind moves from chaos to coherence. Another essential system in this transformation is the hippocampus. This structure is responsible for memory processing and contextual understanding. Trauma and chronic stress can shrink the hippocampus, making it difficult to make sense of the past. But healing can reverse this. Emotional repair reduces cortisol. Safety cues increase neurogenesis, the creation of new neurons. Slowly, the hippocampus strengthens again. This allows the person to reframe the past with greater nuance and less fear. A strengthened hippocampus means the person can hold their story with more clarity. Memories become less overwhelming. The past becomes less haunting. Events that once triggered emotional collapse become integrated. This is not forgetting. It is understanding. Another key player is the anterior cingulate cortex, involved in empathy, error correction, and emotional balance. When someone begins taking responsibility, this region becomes more active. It allows the person to see their impact on others, to hold discomfort without shutting down, to make amends with sincerity, to adjust behavior with intention. Meanwhile, the insula, the region that helps humans sense internal states, begins to reawaken. Many people disconnected from their emotions during the fall. The insula dims during dissociation or emotional suppression, but in healing, it strengthens. The person becomes better at sensing their needs, their emotions, their boundaries. Their body becomes a guide again rather than an enemy. These neural shifts do not happen all at once. They happen slowly, subtly, through repeated experience, through gentle awareness, through new habits, through emotional honesty, through sustained effort. Neuroplasticity is shaped by repetition far more than intensity. Small changes practiced consistently reshape the brain more deeply than dramatic efforts practiced rarely. This is why the redemption journey often feels gradual. Transformation unfolds in moments so small they could easily be missed. A slightly kinder thought, a deeper breath, a more honest conversation, a moment of patience rather than impulsivity, a gentle pause before reacting, a choice to repair instead of withdraw. These micro-movements are biological sculptors. They carve new trails in the brain. Over time, these trails become pathways, then roads, then highways. The person who once felt consumed by shame begins to experience self-compassion with increasing ease. The person who once avoided responsibility begins to take ownership more naturally. The person who once reacted in fear begins responding with clarity. The person who once shut down begins staying present. The person who once felt trapped begins feeling capable of change. The transformation becomes visible not only in neural pathways, but in behavior, relationships, choices, and inner experience. The brain that was once shaped by the fall becomes shaped by the rise. Neuroplasticity also explains why redemption is not a return to the old self. The old pathways are not simply rebuilt, new ones emerge. The self that rises after the fall is not the same as the self that fell. The brain has reorganized, the psyche has deepened, the emotional world has broadened, the identity has expanded. The person does not reclaim who they were, they become who they were meant to be. This biological rebirth supports the final stages of redemption, the rebuilding of relationships, the restoration of trust, the reintegration into society, and the emergence of a new identity shaped not by perfection, but by transformation. Redemption in relationships. Redemption is not only an internal journey, it is a relational one. No human being lives in isolation. Every life is woven into the lives of others. Partners, family, friends, colleagues, communities. When someone falls, the impact ripples outward. And when someone rises, the rise is often supported, witnessed, or challenged by those around them. Redemption, at its core, is as much about reconnection as it is about self-transformation. Relationships are where the deepest wounds occur. They are also where the deepest healing can unfold. Humans are biologically wired for connection. The nervous system regulates itself through touch, eye contact, tone of voice, and presence. Emotional injuries often arise from moments where connection failed: betrayal, abandonment, conflict, misunderstanding, neglect. Likewise, emotional repair often unfolds within the warm resonance of genuine human connection. To understand redemption in relationships, we must explore apology, repair, trust, and reconnection not as social niceties, but as profound psychological processes. The first step is acknowledgement. Before any apology can be meaningful, there must be a clear and honest recognition of the impact one's actions had on another person. This requires self-awareness. It requires empathy. It requires looking beyond intentions and seeing the actual consequences. Many conflicts deepen because people cling to what they meant rather than acknowledging what occurred. But redemption begins when a person shifts from defending their intention to understanding another's experience. Acknowledgement is not simply saying, "I'm sorry." It is saying, "I see you. I see how this affected you. I understand the pain it caused." This recognition alone can begin to soften the protective barriers around another person's heart. It validates their reality. It tells them they are not invisible. It gives them the dignity of being understood. Once acknowledgement has taken root, apology becomes meaningful. A true apology is an act of courage. It is not a performance of remorse. It is a sincere expression of responsibility. Acknowledging harm does not diminish the self. It strengthens it. The person who apologizes sincerely is not weaker. They are braver. They are facing the truth openly rather than hiding behind defensiveness or pride. A genuine apology contains three elements: recognition of harm, expression of remorse, commitment to change. All three must be present. Without recognition, the apology feels hollow. Without remorse, it feels mechanical. Without commitment to change, it feels like an attempt to escape accountability. When all three come together, the apology becomes a transformative moment, one that begins to rebuild the bridge between two hearts. Trust, however, does not return through words alone. Trust is built through consistent action over time. It grows not from what someone says, but from what they do, from showing up, from keeping promises, from behaving differently, from embodying the responsibility taken. Trust is a process of repetition. Each moment of integrity becomes a stitch. Each consistent action becomes a thread. Slowly, the fabric of the relationship strengthens again. Rebuilding trust requires patience from both sides. The one who seeks redemption must understand that the hurt person's fear is not unreasonable. It is protective. Trust was broken, and the nervous system remembers. The one who was hurt must observe the new behavior not once or twice, but over time. Trust grows through evidence, not hope. But when they see genuine effort, honest responsibility, and gradual change, the heart may begin to open again. In many relationships, reconnection takes place in layers. It begins with small exchanges, a brief conversation, a moment of shared vulnerability, a quiet instance of being present for one another. These micro moments of connection send signals of safety to the nervous system. Slowly, the bond that once felt fragile begins to strengthen. In some situations, relationships cannot return to what they were. Sometimes the damage is too deep. Sometimes the paths diverge. Sometimes forgiveness occurs without reconciliation. Redemption does not always guarantee restoration, but even when relationships cannot be rebuilt, repair can still happen internally. Understanding the impact, taking responsibility, and growing from the experience still transform the person. The lessons carried forward shape future relationships with greater wisdom and integrity. In relationships that do heal, something remarkable emerges. The bond becomes deeper than before the fall. Pain, when processed with honesty and compassion, becomes the soil in which intimacy grows. People who have moved through conflict with sincerity often feel more connected, more resilient, more trusting. They have weathered a storm and discovered they can survive it together. Science supports this truth. Research in attachment theory shows that relationships strengthen when ruptures are followed by repair. It is not the absence of conflict that creates secure bonds. It is the ability to repair after conflict. Rupture, followed by reconnection, deepens trust. It teaches both individuals that relationships can withstand difficulty. It teaches them that love is not fragile but adaptive. not static, but alive. The body responds to relational repair as well. When a relationship moves from conflict toward healing, oxytocin, the bonding hormone, increases. Heart rate synchrony improves. Stress hormones decrease. The nervous system shifts from defensive states to states of safety and connection. This biological shift is part of what redemption feels like, a sense of exhale in the presence of another. Another dimension of relational redemption is self-forgiveness. Often, the hardest person to forgive is oneself. Even after others have forgiven, the internal critic may continue punishing. This inner resistance is part of the emotional landscape that must be repaired. Self-forgiveness does not erase responsibility. It honors it. It recognizes that guilt has done its work, and that continuing to carry self-condemnation no longer leads to growth. Self-forgiveness arises when the person sees themselves with clarity, compassion, and truth. When they recognize that they are not defined by their worst moment. When they understand that the fall was part of their human journey and that the rise is equally part of it. This inner release allows them to show up more authentically in relationships. It allows love to flow more freely. It allows trust both in oneself and in others to deepen. Redemption in relationships also involves boundaries. Not rigid walls, but healthy structure. Boundaries reflect self-respect. They protect healing. They ensure that new patterns are sustainable. When a relationship enters a phase of repair, clear boundaries support trust rather than restrict it. They create predictability. They reduce fear. They allow both people to feel safe as they move toward one another. In some relationships, mutual redemption occurs. One person's transformation inspires the other. Their honesty encourages honesty. Their vulnerability invites vulnerability. Their growth awakens growth. This mutual transformation can create bonds of extraordinary depth. Bonds built not on perfection, but on truth. Not on illusion, but on real, lived experience. In other relationships, redemption means stepping away, recognizing that the healthiest choice is distance, that healing requires space, that not every bond can be repaired. Even in these cases, the act of taking responsibility and growing internally changes the relational patterns carried into future connections. Ultimately, redemption in relationships is about reconnecting with humanity, both one's own and another's. It is about seeing each other not as symbols of pain, but as complex, imperfect beings capable of suffering, healing, learning, and loving. It is about transforming the relational wounds that once created separation into bridges of understanding and compassion. This chapter reveals a profound truth. Humans break in relationship. Humans heal in relationship. And the journey of redemption, while deeply personal, is also deeply communal. It is the process of returning to others with a clearer mind, a softer heart, and a more grounded sense of self. It is the rebuilding of trust, intimacy, and connection, the essential elements of a meaningful life. Social redemption. Redemption does not occur in isolation, even when the internal work is deeply personal. Human beings are social creatures, shaped by the presence, expectations, and judgments of others. Our identities form in relationship to community. Our behavior influences and is influenced by society. And when a person falls, whether through a public mistake, a moral failure, or a private collapse that affects the lives around them, society becomes part of the story. Social redemption is the process by which an individual re-enters the collective moral world. It is the journey of rebuilding reputation, restoring belonging, renegotiating one's place in the community, and reconciling the public self with the private transformation that has taken place. This aspect of redemption often unfolds slowly because social trust is a different kind of trust, broader, more fragile, and shaped not only by personal relationships but by cultural narratives, communal memory, and collective emotion. The foundation of social redemption is accountability. When someone harms others or violates the norms of the community, people naturally demand acknowledgement. Society depends on shared values to maintain cohesion. When those values are broken, the social fabric tears. Accountability is the thread that begins mending it. But social accountability is more complex than personal responsibility. It involves public acknowledgement, transparency, and often the willingness to accept consequences that reflect the magnitude of the harm. This public dimension can feel punishing, especially when shame becomes amplified by the eyes of others. Humans are wired to care deeply about reputation. In ancestral environments, belonging meant survival, and exile meant death. The nervous system still responds to social rejection as if it were physical pain. This is why public mistakes feel devastating. The body interprets social judgment as threat. The psyche responds with fear, withdrawal, or defensiveness. Yet social redemption cannot begin until the individual stops resisting this discomfort. Defensiveness may protect the ego, but it prevents transformation. When a person accepts the consequences of their actions without collapse or self-pity, the social environment begins to shift. People may not forgive immediately, they may not trust quickly, but they do take notice. Society recognizes courage. It recognizes sincerity. It recognizes when a person stands in truth rather than avoidance. Many cultures formalize this process through restorative justice. Unlike punitive justice, which focuses on punishment, restorative justice focuses on repair. It invites the person who caused harm, the people who were harmed, and the community affected to participate in a structured dialogue. The goals are understanding, accountability, reparation, and reintegration. This model reflects something ancient. Humans heal collectively. Communities restore themselves through honesty, empathy, and shared responsibility. In indigenous cultures, restoration is often ceremonial. A wrongdoer may participate in rituals that cleanse, confess, and recommit them to the values of the tribe. The community witnesses the transformation, acknowledging both the harm and the growth. This collective witnessing is essential. It tells the individual that while they are responsible for their actions, they are not beyond restoration. They remain part of the circle. In modern society, social redemption often unfolds through actions rather than rituals. A person demonstrates change through integrity, consistency, and service. They rebuild trust through behavior that aligns with their transformed values. They engage with the community, not to prove something, but to contribute genuinely. Social redemption is not about image management. It is about living the change so deeply that the transformation becomes undeniable. One of the challenges of social redemption is the lingering presence of stigma. People may continue to associate the individual with their past, freezing them in time. Stigma is the psychological scar left on society's memory. It can prevent reintegration, even when the person has changed internally. This creates a painful tension. The individual may feel renewed, while the community still sees the shadow of who they were. But even stigma can be softened. Over time, new behaviors accumulate. New contributions become visible. New chapters take shape. People begin to recognize the growth, even if gradually. Social forgiveness is slower than personal forgiveness, but it is possible. It emerges from seeing the transformed self consistently inhabit the world. Social redemption also requires humility. The individual cannot demand acceptance. They cannot force trust. They cannot insist that others forget the past. Forced reconciliation is fragile and often false. True social redemption involves patience. It involves understanding that people need time to adjust their perceptions, just as the individual needed time to change internally. The transformation must be lived, not argued. In many cases, the individual becomes a source of wisdom for the community. Having walked through the fall, the shadow, and the rise, they carry insight that can support others. People who have navigated guilt become gentle guides for those wrestling with responsibility. People who have faced their shadow can help others face theirs. People who have healed their emotional world can become examples of resilience. The very experiences that once caused harm can become catalysts for communal growth when shared responsibly. Then, this is why many cultures historically honored the redeemed, not as saints, but as elders people who had lived the full spectrum of human experience and emerged with humility and compassion. Their wisdom carried weight precisely because it was not theoretical. It was lived. But social redemption is not limited to individuals. Entire communities, generations, and societies undergo redemption. Cultures acknowledge past injustices. Nations confront wrongdoing. Collective memory shifts. Apologies are issued. Reparations are made. New futures are built. Social redemption at the collective level mirrors the same psychological processes as personal redemption: acknowledgement, responsibility, repair, and renewed identity. In this sense, redemption is a universal arc that stretches from the smallest human interaction to the largest social transformations. It speaks to the deep truth that humans, individually and collectively, are always in the process of becoming, always capable of change, always capable of rising after falling. As the individual continues to grow, something begins to unfold inside them, a shift in identity, a new sense of self that is no longer defined by the fall, but shaped by the journey through it. This transformation marks the next phase, the emergence of a new identity born not from avoidance, but from truth, resilience, and renewal. The new identity. There comes a moment in the redemption arc when the person realizes they are no longer who they were. The fall, the shadow, the responsibility, the emotional repair, the relational healing, the rewiring of the brain, all of it has been shaping something new beneath the surface. Slowly, quietly, imperceptibly at first, a new identity begins to form. Not an identity crafted from denial or performance or self-protection, but an identity rooted in truth. This new identity is not a costume. It is not a mask. It is not a return to an older version of the self. It is a deeper emergence, a matured form of being that could not have existed without the fall. It carries wisdom where there was once naivety, compassion where there was once defensiveness, humility where there was once pride, and a grounded sense of self where there was once fragmentation. To understand how this new identity forms, we must explore the psychological architecture of selfhood. Humans are narrative beings. Identity is not merely a collection of traits. It is a story we believe about who we are, why we act the way we do, how we relate to the world, and what meaning our lives hold. When the fall occurs, the old narrative collapses. The story becomes inconsistent. The protagonist becomes uncertain. The plot breaks. Redemption is the process of rewriting that story, not by erasing the broken chapters, but by integrating them into a larger arc. In the early stages, this rewriting feels fragile. The person may say, "I'm trying to change. I am learning. I am growing." But eventually, a shift occurs. They no longer feel like someone trying to become new. They feel like someone who is new. The change moves from effort to embodiment. This embodiment happens through several psychological transformations. The first is self-honesty. A new identity cannot form on falsehood. Only when someone has seen the full truth of themselves, the strengths, the flaws, the wounds, the courage, the harm done, the love still within them, can they build a self that is real. Self-honesty removes the distortions that once shaped behavior. The individual stops hiding from their own reflection. They see themselves clearly, and this clarity stabilizes them. The second is self-acceptance. Acceptance does not mean approval of the fall. It means understanding the full complexity of being human. It means recognizing that imperfection is not an exception, but a universal condition. It means allowing oneself to exist without constant self-punishment. Self-acceptance softens the internal critic, letting the psyche breathe. It allows the person to grow from a place of dignity rather than fear. The third is integration. Integration means the past is no longer split off. The shadow is no longer exiled. The pain is no longer hidden. The person can speak of their fall without collapsing into shame. They can remember what happened without being overwhelmed. The past becomes part of the story, not the entire story. It becomes a chapter rather than a cage. The fourth is value realignment. During the fall, people often recognize that they were living out of alignment with their deepest values. The redemption process reveals what truly matters: integrity, compassion, responsibility, truth, connection. The new identity is built around these values, not as abstract ideals, but as lived commitments. The person begins making choices that reflect their inner core rather than their fears or wounds. The fifth is confidence, not in the superficial sense, but in the quiet stability that comes from surviving darkness. A person who has walked through their own shadow does not fear themselves. They no longer run from their emotions. They no longer collapse in the face of discomfort. They have seen themselves at their worst, and they have risen. This kind of confidence cannot be given. It must be earned through lived experience. Another essential element of the new identity is humility. Humility is not self-doubt. It is not weakness. It is the recognition that one is always capable of error, always capable of learning, always capable of causing harm or offering healing. Humility grounds the new identity. It prevents the ego from returning to old defensive patterns. It keeps the heart open, curious, receptive. It transforms the person from someone who seeks control to someone who seeks understanding. Neuroscience supports this transformation. As new neural pathways strengthen pathways associated with empathy, self-regulation, insight, and long-term thinking, the brain begins to stabilize into a new pattern. Old triggers lose their power. Old habits lose their automaticity. New patterns become the default. The nervous system shifts from chronic survival to consistent regulation. The identity that emerges sits on this biological foundation. The new identity also expresses itself in behavior. The person no longer simply acts differently in specific situations. They live differently. Their choices reflect patience rather than impulsivity, honesty rather than avoidance, compassion rather than fear, responsibility rather than denial. These behaviors are not forced. They are the natural expression of a self that has been reshaped. Relationships reflect this shift. The redeemed self interacts with others more gently. They listen more deeply. They speak more honestly. They respect boundaries, both their own and others. They no longer seek validation through performance or approval. They show up authentically, understanding that genuine connection arises from truth, not perfection. This new identity is also more resilient. Having faced their own collapse, the person understands that life will inevitably bring difficulty. But they no longer fear difficulty with the same intensity. They know they can endure. They know they can grow. They know they can repair. They know they can rise. Resilience becomes their inner posture, a quiet strength that does not need to announce itself. Culturally, this stage of redemption resembles the archetype of the wounded healer, someone who has been broken and rebuilt, someone who has walked through suffering and emerged with wisdom, someone who carries the memory of the fall, not as a stigma, but as a source of understanding. Many spiritual traditions value such individuals because their compassion is earned. Their presence carries a depth that cannot be taught. The new identity also includes a shift in purpose. The fall often collapses old ambitions driven by ego, fear, or insecurity. In the space left behind, new motivations emerge to live truthfully, to contribute meaningfully, to love more authentically, to act with integrity. Purpose becomes less about achievement and more about alignment, less about proving something and more about becoming someone. And perhaps the most profound quality of the new identity is peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of inner coherence. The person no longer wars with themselves. The inner divisions have softened. The shadow has been acknowledged. The past has been integrated. The values have been clarified. The heart has been opened. This peace is not fragile. It is the steady, grounded peace that comes from knowing oneself deeply. The emergence of this new identity does not mean the journey is complete. Redemption is not an endpoint, but an ongoing evolution. Yet this chapter marks a turning point, the moment the person steps into a self that can hold the future with clarity, humility, and strength. And this emerging self begins looking ahead, not with fear, not with regret, but with a quiet, steady question. What will I become next? This question leads naturally into the final stage of the redemption arc, the vision of the future self, shaped by the lessons of the fall and the wisdom of the rise. The future self. The final movement of redemption is not a return to the past, nor is it a simple continuation of the present. It is the emergence of a future that could not have existed before the fall, a future shaped by insight, by humility, by resilience, and by the quiet strength forged in the fires of transformation. This future self is not an idealized version of perfection. It is a grounded, conscious, deeply human expression of who one becomes after walking through darkness and rising with intention. To understand the future self, we must begin with the recognition that identity is always evolving. Every choice, every insight, every moment of growth shapes the unfolding trajectory of a life. The fall disrupted this trajectory, breaking the old storyline. The rise reshaped it. Now, the future becomes a canvas not blank, but reoriented, renewed, widened by the wisdom that suffering unveiled. The future self is built on meaning. Meaning is not something bestowed from outside. It is something shaped from within. It emerges when a person aligns their actions with their deepest values, when they choose paths that reflect integrity rather than impulse, when they move toward what feels authentic rather than what feels safe. Meaning is the thread that weaves purpose through daily life. And after redemption, the search for meaning becomes clearer, more honest, and more internal. Purpose shifts as well. Before the fall, purpose may have been driven by ego, by fear of inadequacy, by comparison, by the desire to impress or escape. After the fall, purpose becomes quieter and more rooted. It becomes the desire to contribute rather than to prove, to connect rather than to perform, to grow rather than to flee. Purpose becomes aligned with truth rather than image. And this alignment becomes the compass for the future self. The future self is shaped by resilience. Resilience is not the absence of vulnerability. It is the ability to remain present with vulnerability without collapsing. It is the knowledge that emotional storms can be weathered, that setbacks do not erase progress, that discomfort is not danger. The nervous system, once overwhelmed by threat, learns through healing to return to balance more quickly. This biological resilience supports psychological resilience, and together they create a foundation of stability. With this newfound resilience comes courage. Not dramatic courage, but everyday courage. The courage to have difficult conversations, to admit uncertainty, to stay honest when it feels uncomfortable, to set boundaries, to trust oneself, to open the heart again after it was fractured. Courage becomes a quiet companion, shaping choices with steadiness rather than force. The future self also carries a deeper sense of compassion. Having walked through suffering, the person sees the suffering of others with new eyes. Judgment softens, empathy expands. The heart recognizes that every human being carries invisible wounds. Every person has moments of falling. Every life contains hidden battles. This compassion becomes part of how the future self moves through the world, not with superiority, but with understanding, not with naivete, but with kindness grounded in experience. Compassion extends inward as well. Self-compassion becomes a tool, a practice, a reflex. The future self does not revert to harsh self-punishment when imperfections emerge. Instead, they respond with curiosity, with patience, with gentleness. They recognize that growth is non-linear, that healing is spiraling, that being human means continually learning. The internal critic that once dominated the psyche now becomes a softer voice, balanced by wisdom and care. The future self also approaches relationships differently. Having learned the fragility and strength of connection, they communicate more openly, listen more deeply, and choose relationships that reflect mutual respect and authenticity. They understand the importance of repair. They recognize the value of boundaries. They know that love is not sustained through perfection, but through continuous honesty and effort. This relational maturity becomes one of the most visible expressions of the future self. In terms of behavior, the future self acts from alignment rather than reaction. They pause before responding. They consider long-term consequences. They choose actions that reflect their values even when no one is watching. This integrity becomes a stabilizing force, maintaining the coherence that was rebuilt during the redemption journey. Creativity often awakens during this stage. Not necessarily artistic creativity, but the broader creativity of imagining new possibilities. For many people, the fall shatters the illusion that life must follow a predetermined path. In the aftermath, New paths become visible. New desires emerge. New passions ignite. The future becomes expansive rather than constrained. The person begins to dream again, not as an escape, but as a direction. Spirituality also deepens for many, whether rooted in religion, nature, philosophy, or inner reflection. The sense of connection to something larger than oneself grows. The fall often strips away superficial beliefs and inherited narratives. What remains is a more intimate form of spirituality, a quiet awareness of interconnectedness, a humility before the mystery of existence, a sense of reverence for being alive at all. This spirituality informs the future self, not through dogma, but through presence. Another defining quality of the future self is integrity, not the rigid correctness of moral perfectionism, but the lived consistency of a person aligned within. Integrity means the internal and external selves match. It means actions reflect values. It means truth guides decisions. This internal coherence creates peace, even in the face of uncertainty. The future self also cultivates gratitude. Gratitude not only for joy but for growth. Gratitude for the people who stayed. Gratitude for the lessons learned. Gratitude for the resilience built. Gratitude for the second chance not given by fate, but created through effort. Gratitude becomes a lens through which the person sees themselves and their world. One of the most transformative aspects of the future self is acceptance. Acceptance of what cannot be changed. Acceptance of the past without being defined by it. Acceptance of uncertainty. Acceptance of imperfection. Acceptance of other people's humanity. Acceptance is not resignation. It is the wisdom to discern where energy should be placed toward what can grow, not what cannot be undone. The future self is also committed to ongoing growth. Redemption is not a single transformation. It is the beginning of a lifelong evolution. The future self remains open to learning, revising, healing, and maturing. They approach life with curiosity rather than fear, with humility rather than ego, with steadiness rather than avoidance. Growth becomes not a chore, but a natural continuation of the redemption arc. And finally, the future self holds vision. A vision not of grand achievement, but of meaningful existence. A vision of living truthfully. A vision of contributing to others. A vision of building relationships rooted in authenticity. A vision of moving through the world with awareness, compassion, and purpose. This vision becomes the guiding light, the internal North Star, shaped by everything the person has endured, faced, healed, and transcended. The future self stands at the end of the redemption arc, not as a perfect being, not as a flawless success story, but as a whole human one who fell, confronted their darkness, rebuilt themselves, and stepped forward with wisdom. A human who carries the past with integrity, the present with awareness, and the future with hope. And so the journey completes its circle. A fall that once felt like an ending becomes the foundation of a new beginning. A life once fractured becomes whole. A story once broken becomes meaningful. And the person who walks through darkness emerges with a deeper light, the quiet, steady light of redemption.